All right.
Okay, hello everyone, and welcome. I'm Ibrahim Bagheri. I'm a professor in electrical, computer, and biomedical engineering at Toronto Metropolitan University, formerly known as Ryerson University. This is our invited speakers series in the Responsible AI program. Responsible AI is a multidisciplinary, multi-sector training initiative to build sustainable connections, research, training, and knowledge capacity, and a pipeline of highly qualified trainees in Canada's fastest growing knowledge economy sector. The Responsible AI initiative is a part of the NSERC Collaborative Research and Training Experience CREATE program. And it's my privilege to introduce our invited speaker today, Professor Dominic Martin. Thank you, Dominic, for accepting our invitation to speak to the group today. Dominic Martin is a professor of ethics at the School of Management of the Université du Québec, Montréal. His work combines approaches from ethics, contemporary political philosophy, economics, and law to grapple with questions of distributive justice and the role of the state and intergovernmental regulatory bodies in shaping market structures and the ethical obligations of business. His recent research projects deal with the new ethical issues associated with the rise of artificial intelligence and the increased usage of algorithms in society, such as questions of algorithmic accountability, the creation of artificial moral agents, and the socio-economic impacts of AI. So welcome again, Dominic, and the virtual floor is yours.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much, Ibrahim, for the introduction. I will start maybe just by sharing my slides. All right, so it should be visible right now. Can you see it?
Yes.
Can everybody see it? All right, excellent. So yes, today I want to talk. Oh, all my apologies, I was a bit less in my windows. Okay, so today I want to talk about the topic of artificial moral agency or artificial moral agents. I think it's a topic that is becoming increasingly popular. It's a difficult and fascinating and very important research topic. In fact, that calls for expertise in a lot of different fields. But just before I say anything more, maybe let me just give you an idea of what I mean by that. Basically, issues of artificial moral agency deal with issues of building some form of moral capabilities or moral decision-making capabilities in automated systems such as AI system. A very typical example of that would be like a system like a self-driving car, for instance. There's a lot of situations where this type of system will face a choice where the options in the choice are morally laden. An example that is often discussed in the literature is the so-called tunnel problem. So let's say we have a self-driving car. The car is driving on the street. We're approaching the entrance of a tunnel, and then a child crossed the street, and the car must act. It must either try to avoid the child, but in that case, it's likely to hit the entrance of the tunnel and kill the car's passenger, or it can just continue in the same direction, and then it will most likely kill the car. So what the car ought to do in that situation. And there's all sorts of variations on the tunnel problem. In fact, the problem in itself is also based on similar problems that have been discussed for a long time in moral philosophy, such as the trolley problem, problems about people, like how people should behave in various types of situations. My main interest here today is not that much to argue about one specific thing that the car should do or not in that situation, but simply show that this issue of making decisions, that are aligned with human morality, is a real and concrete issue that we're facing today. And if we want to develop AI system, we need to be able to build these capacities within them. But moral philosophy is a difficult topic. Moral decision making is complicated in itself, and building these sort of capabilities within a system is also a difficult question. So before I say more about what, like, I present the plan of what I'm going to say today, let me just start maybe with a quote from one of my favorite television series. So I don't know if you've watched the series. So there are now 4 seasons to watch. It's called The Good Place. It's a series produced by Michael Schultz. And that premiere at NBC. So I guess one way to summarize it would be to say, so the same way that chemists, at Breaking Bad, which was a really good series that put chemistry really in the center of the action, if you want. The Good Place is really the series for moral philosophers, because there's a lot of the intrigue gravitates around issues of ethics, of teaching moral philosophy, of becoming a better person and knowing more about the field, or developing some sort of expertise in the field. Now, I don't want to spoil any punch from the series, but what I'm gonna say is it really takes place in the few first minutes of the series. So The Good Place, basically, we learn in like the first minutes of the first episode is something similar to our notion of paradise. And then so in when the series starts, we have the main character here, Eleanor Sheltrop, that appears in that place and is welcomed by Michael, who seems to be some sort of the like manager or like god or entity that is responsible of the good place. And so he explains her that she died and how she died, and now she's now in the good place. And after that he invites her and maybe other character to come to some sort of outside. And he makes a little speech to explain to everyone where they are and what is going on. And most importantly, why is it that they ended up in that place and not the other place that is called the bad place in the series? And so here it goes. So he says, how do we know that you were good? How are we sure? During your time on Earth, every one of your action had a positive or a negative value, depending on how much good or bad that action put into the universe. Every sandwich you ate, every time you bought a magazine, every single thing you did had an effect that rippled over time and ultimately created some amount of good or bad. When your time on Earth has ended, we calculated the total value of your life using our perfectly accurate measuring system. Only the people with the very highest scores, the true cream of the crop, get to come here to the good place. So maybe if like the universe was like that, okay, maybe if it was possible, if moral good or bad was a perfectly computable state, well, then maybe it would be much easier to create artificial moral agents. Unfortunately, there is not a lot of indication that it is. Morality is very hard to compute, to measure in a quantitative way. And that's one of the reasons why the topic is so difficult and fascinating at the same time. So what I want to do today more specifically, it's 5 things basically, or 4 things. 4 things, sorry. First, I just want to sort of explain in more details what is an artificial moral agent. So there are some important, I think, notions here, like conceptual notions with this idea. Then I want to look at one specific approach for implementing artificial moral agency in a system. There are many reasons why I'm choosing this approach, but I think one of the main reasons is that it's one of the most developed approach that is out there today. That's not to say that it's complete or perfect. So we'll also show the issues or the challenges with that approach. But I think it's definitely one of the most complete attempt at developing an approach for implementing artificial moral agency in a system. Then I want to give you some sort of idea of what the literature says in general, or what are other possible approaches for achieving that goal that have been put forward in the last 10 or 20 years. And after that, I will conclude. Okay, so what is artificial moral agency, or what is an artificial moral agent? Well, first, let us start with the notion of an agent. So there's I would say that there's a fair level of agreement in philosophy and in philosophy of mind and even metaethics, perhaps, on what an agent is. So there are many different formulations, but it often gravitate around this idea that an agent is an entity that can form like the right mental state or action based on like the right belief or action, and can intervene like suitably based on these mental states. Okay, it's sometimes called a standard definition. It relies heavily on the work of Davidson and Elizabeth Anscombe, but that work also relies heavily on a lot of things that have been said in the like at least Western philosophical tradition before that, and it may even go back as far as Aristotle, actually. One example of a conception of artificial moral agency that conforms to the standard conception would be the conception that is put forward by Christian List and Philip Pettit in their book Group Agency: The Possibility, Design, and Status of Corporate Agents. So in that book, the authors are mostly interested in trying to see if we can, if like entities such as a corporation, like a business firm, or even a state, can be conceived as an agent or a group agent, and under what condition. And that's not really what I want to do here. But in order to do that, of course, they need to start with some conception of agency to see if a corporation, for instance, could fit with that conception. In the case of corporation, they do say that it is the case, but they claim that state cannot be seen as agent for other reasons in the book. But they start the book by putting forward that conception, and basically what they say is that an agent must have three features. So first, it must have representational states. Okay, so it may be able to represent things that exist in the environment. Second, it must have motivational states. So it must want things to be in a certain way in the environment. Exactly. Okay. And third, it must be able to intervene suitably in the environment, in the sense that it must have a capacity to process its representational state and motivational state whenever that the environment fails to match a motivating specification. Okay. So for instance, according to that definition, something like a thermostat could very well be described as an agent. Okay. It has representational states because it can represent what is the temperature in a room. It has motivational states because it has a set point. So I want the room to stay at 22 Celsius degrees, for instance. And because it's plugged into a system, it can intervene suitably in the environment to ensure that the temperature in the room will be the one that corresponds to a set point. Okay. And this is quite standard and well accepted. What that means, however, is that our common notion of agency is very broad and inclusive. A lot of things can qualify as an agent because we only need these three features. But at the same time, it would be very hard to claim that a system that has these three features is not an agent. So that would create all sorts of inconsistencies and other problems elsewhere. Okay. So it's very broad. That's an issue, but at the same time, it's hard to exclude. There's also some like vagueness in the definition, because like what exactly is a suitable intervention? At what point can we consider that the intervention is suitable or not? Agent can often make those. So if they're biased systematically and they systematically take the wrong decision, then I guess they would not qualify as agents because they cannot intervene suitably in the environment. If they always make the right decision, then certainly they qualify. But there's a whole spectrum of possibility between these two extremes. Okay, so that's also an issue with the definition. In any case, there's a lot of things we can consider to be an agent. Now, artificial moral agent. Well, in that case as well, the definition is also very broad and very inclusive, simply because there's a wide range of ways in which we can ethically align a system. Okay, when you think of it, even something like a virus could be ethically aligned to some extent. Okay, because we could produce a virus, let's say, that would target specific mosquitoes in African countries, say, to kill them and prevent to fight against mosquito-borne diseases, for instance. Okay, so we could design a virus in a way that like it would fulfill some ethical purpose or something like that. Okay, but we could go much further than that and design something like an AI oracle, say, or a system that is extremely evolved, that is super intelligent, and that would have like moral competences that go far beyond what we have with the virus. Okay, so the same way that the notion of agency is very broad, there are multiple levels of ethical alignment of a system. But as soon as a system is at least minimally ethically aligned and it qualifies as an agent, I think it's fine to call it an artificial moral agent. But of course, not all artificial moral agents have the same level of artificial moral agency. Some systems have a much higher level or are much stronger than other. Okay, so that's why I'm trying to represent here on this slide. So we have our AI oracle that would be like at the top portion of the spectrum, if you want. Then we have our human that is also still a fairly high level human agent. Well, perhaps not Homer Simpson, but human in general. Even something like a robot vacuum cleaner could count as an artificial moral agent, in fact, because these systems now more and more, they're designed in a way, to be, well, they're agents for sure. Okay, they have representational states, motivational states, they can intervene suitably in the environment, but they're also designed to like not disturb own pets or to be pet friendly and all sorts of other things also. So there is some form of value alignment within the system. So it could count as an artificial moral agent. In fact, even something like a smart thermostat, I guess, could count as an artificial moral agent. It's an agent because it's a thermostat, but there's all sorts of feature built into the system also to like minimize the energy consumption, which is like a ethically, which is an ethical goal, sorry. So I guess this type of system would be very at the lower end of our spectrum, but I think it could still qualify. Then we have like just a regular thermostat. So let's say that would be on the other side, but even that is debatable, I think. But maybe it's hard to see in what way like a really like just a plain normal thermostat could be ethically aligned, because it's really just gonna set the temperature at any set point that the human agent decides to pick. But now even there we could have some, I don't know, minimal forms of ethical alignment. If the thermostat is made in a way that it's easier to see for people with visual impairments, say, okay, or it's written in multiple languages because we want this to be inclusive, and we don't want the thermostat to be really using like Western-based symbols and perspective. Okay, so I don't know exactly if you're following my example, but even for that type of system, there could be some minimal form of ethical alignment. But in general, I would put it on the other, like outside the spectrum. A virus also, I think, could not be considered to be an artificial moral agent or a moral agent in that case, simply because it's not an agent. So a virus has no representational state, it has no motivation, and it cannot really intervene in the environment. And in fact, to attribute these properties to a virus would be to perform some form of anthropomorphization, or would be ascribing agency to something that doesn't have. Like a virus is completely controlled and by its environment, in fact. And when it becomes more potent, say, or more dangerous, it's simply because it was badly replicated or something like that. And it's not an intervention that is coming from the system itself. A bacteria, on the other side, maybe could qualify as an agent. perhaps not all type of bacteria, but because they have some form of signaling system and they can also like protect themselves from some certain threats in the environment. So even a bacteria perhaps could count. Okay. So many types of agents are artificial moral agents. I think we need to certainly we need to be careful not to ascribe this notion to only to systems that would look like humans or have the level of moral agency that humans have. And this is very important also. This is very important, not also, but this is very important because when we realize that, we also realize that there are already a lot of systems that we've built and are working in the environment that are artificial moral agents. They are probably agents that have a much lower level of moral agency than a human being or even a self-driving car, but they are still artificial moral agents. Okay, so this working on that topic and question on this topic and this goal of building moral agency in a system is not something that is like just purely hypothetical about system that we may be able to develop one day. No, because we have systems today that already behave like artificial moral agents and have these features. Of course, they are very limited, but there's still something to say about them. And maybe there are even interesting things to say about how we could scale the properties that these systems have to much higher level properties. Okay, I'll say more about that later on. But that's really something important to keep in mind. This idea that it's already we already have these sort of agents. And here I'm providing a couple of examples. So I mentioned that already, but I don't know if you see it when I highlight things on the screen. But so smart thermostats, a lot of embedded devices also can be considered to be artificial moral agent. Mechanical robots. So we have, for instance, some of the robots of the Massachusetts firms, Boston Dynamics. So we've seen a lot the robot dog. How is it called? Spot, maybe? I don't recall now. But here, so I've put a picture of their stretch robot, which is a robot to be used in facilities that is useful to carry merchandise around. Well, this robot has a lot of moral competence built in, because it must be able to go around in an environment that is unconstrained, where there are people, where people can walk in different directions, do different things. It must ensure that it does not hurt people, it does not break things, and there are probably other things too. Okay, of course, we're far from human level, but we still have a fair amount of artificial agency embedded in the system. We have drones, self-driving cars, and other things. Okay, so we already have these systems, but they don't have human level artificial moral agency. So what would be the best way to develop that type of competence in a system? Should we, I don't know, should we just list thousands of rules? The system should do that, not that, not that. Should we survey people about what is the right or the bad thing to do and try to embody these sort of rule again in the system? Should we ensure that the system imitate the behavior of people that we consider are really morally praiseworthy? So there are all sorts of different ways to do that. And now I want to look at one specific way that has been put forward by Stuart Russell, that you must probably all know, who is a very prominent figure in artificial intelligence, for various reasons, but also because he's one of the author of a very popular book in the field, so Artificial Intelligence, A Modern Approach. It was used a lot in a lot of AI 101 courses in the last decades. But he also is very interested in the questions of ethical issues with the artificial intelligence system. And so he published this book that aims a wider audience in 2019. So it's called Human Compatible Artificial Intelligence and the Problem of Control. So in the book, there's a lot of things in the book. The first part is mostly about all the good things that AI could do for us. You may not learn a lot if you read that today. We've heard that these things in a lot of different places. But in the book, he also, at some point, he also problematized artificial intelligence and the sort of issue that it could raise, especially if we develop very intelligent system. There would be safety issue. There are perhaps existential threat for the human species, or in any case, if a system is very smart and can do a lot of things, we want to ensure that it will behave in a way that is aligned with human morality. So, but how should we do that? And so he says, well, basically we should make sure of three things. So first, we should make sure that this machine objective would be to maximize the realization of human preferences. Second, we should not start with some preloaded definition of what human preferences are or what will maximize them. Quite the opposite. We should build a system in a way that by default, it's uncertain about what those preferences are. And it's trying to figure out what they are in order to maximize their satisfaction. And third, so that's more of an axiom, or anyway, we think that human behavior can provide us information about human preferences and their level of satisfaction. Okay, that's a very important part, by the way, of the approach. We'll see why. But so he says these three things. Okay, and that's basically his approach for developing human compatible artificial intelligence. Now, it's a very interesting approach. As I said, it's interesting for many reasons, but one of them is because it's one of the most worked out approach yet. It's far from being complete, as I said, but in a lot of cases in the literature, unfortunately, we have people putting different approaches forward, but they are still a bit superficial and not very well developed. So this one is more developed at the very least. I think the approach could be maybe like analytically reconstructed to make more sense and to be made clearer. And I would say that there are at least four main components or four main ideas or claims in that approach, at least. The first one is this idea of a revealed preference theory. Okay, it's the idea that we can figure out human beings' preferences based on this behavior. Now, that's not something that Russell's invented. In fact, it's drawing on at least 50, 60 years of literature in economics and in decision theory in economics and behavioral economics to say that. And that's a very common view or theory in the field. Okay, so in the field of economics, it's very important. Ultimately, it's very hard to say anything if you don't have a theory of human behavior or human decision making. Okay, because if you want to like predict or figure out prices in the market, for instance, you need to have some view about what people will do given what they want and what they believe the market is going to do and things like that. Okay, really ultimately to calculate like marginal supply and demand, you really need to have a view about people's decision and how do they make decisions based on their preferences. Okay, and it's very difficult to figure out what are human beings' preferences or desires because those are mental phenomenon that take place within the brain, and we don't have access to that. And that system is way too complicated for us at this point, at least to figure out. Okay, so we need a proxy to access that information. Okay, and it's a big like practical but also like philosophical issue. But a lot of people, economists, for instance, have claimed that behavior is an acceptable proxy for figuring out people's preferences. Okay, and so one of the pioneer in the field is an economist named Paul Samuelson that defended the view, but now like a lot of people endorse that view to some extent also. At the very least, they might not endorse the view, but they're trying to figure out people's desire or preferences through their behavior. So that's component number one. Then there's this idea of inverse reinforcement learning that was not mentioned directly in the quote I pulled out from the book, but he mentioned that in other parts. So Russell's believe that we can discover human preferences based on observing their behavior, like I said, using a technique in artificial intelligence called inverse reinforcement learning. and I'll get back to that also. Now, even if we have these two first components, so that might give us a system that can figure out people's preferences and behave in ways that will maximize them. But this is not a guarantee in any way that the system will be ethically aligned, because what people want may be completely unethical. Okay, to use a simple example, let's say I have Hitler would have a pet robot that would behave, that would be built using component 1 and 2. Well, the robot could still do a lot of evil things because he's trying to maximize Hitler's preferences. Okay, that's a bit of an easy example, but we can think of a lot of other examples. So we still need something to make these capabilities ethical in a way. Okay, so the third component is this endorsement of utilitarianism, more specifically Arseni's version of utilitarianism. And basically what the view says is that the morally right action is an action that will maximize the aggregate level of preference satisfaction in society. Okay, so when you're asking when one is asking oneself what one ought to do, one should try to see which action will maximize not necessarily my own personal preferences, but aggregate preference satisfaction at the level of society, or whatever is my group of reference. Okay, utilitarianism. And then the approach would not really work without an axiom of unlimited or nearly unlimited, to use Russell's word, computation. Okay. Now, this is, as I said, this is very interesting and very promising, but there are also a lot of issues or challenges. Okay. So I thought I would say a few words about what these challenges are. And so I will basically list or explain the challenges with each of the components of the approach. Okay, so first, this idea of revealed preference theory. Okay, so it's, as I said, like in the field of economics, a lot of study is based on an attempt to figure out what are people's preferences based on this behavior. So it's really like a real view that is out there. I don't know if people are defending it, but at least they're relying on that view. Okay, but there are also a lot of issues with revealed preference theory. Okay, for instance, we know that what people want can change through time, obviously. Okay, the desire you have for a specific consumption good, say yesterday, may change today for all sorts of reasons. Okay, sometimes there are rational reasons that we can explain, but there are all sorts of other factors involved, and that's very difficult to factor in within revealed preference theory. Okay, so basically what I'm saying is that maybe even if it's true that in some very idealized situation we can figure out people's preferences based on their behavior, the fact that people's desires change through time make it very difficult to predict their preferences based on their behavior. But also, people often have false belief, okay, or wrong beliefs about the world, and that's also a big issue for figuring out people's preferences based on their behavior. Because if I see a person, I don't know, if I see someone making a specific purchase in the market, say, well, I can think that's because okay, let's give me an easy example. Let me give you an easy example. If I see someone purchasing a red dress, okay, so I can think, okay, this person has a desire for wearing red clothes, okay, but maybe that person is Daltonian, to use a simple example, and is not seeing colors properly. So that person has formed false belief about the world, and that's why she's buying the red, what I am seeing as a red dress, because she thinks it's a blue dress. Okay, so what does that mean? It means that in fact that person's desire is not wearing red clothes, it's wearing blue clothes, or anyway, something like that. Okay, so the fact that we have false desires, and we often do, makes it very difficult to predict our preferences based on our behavior. And then there's the fact that we often make mistake also, even if we have the right behavior, right beliefs, and even if our desires don't change, we make mistakes in figuring out what is the right action to satisfy that desire or that preference. Okay. And there are also other issues. So for instance, so economists speak of preferences, but in fact, what is valuable to them is well-being. Okay, they think that preference satisfaction is a good proxy for well-being, and what they want is in fact measure the level of well-being, say that consumption will produce, or what type of action or policy will produce on people. Okay, ultimately, preferences are a proxy for well-being, but that's also an issue. So we may wonder if preferences are really the best proxy to people's well-being, if that's really what we want to maximize. So that's another issue. Okay, so maybe even going through this idea of a preference is an issue. Okay, now these limitations are not, and these are not new things that I'm saying. They are very well known even among people that use revealed preference theory. Russell is also very aware of them, but I think it's important to mention. Then the second component was this idea of inverse reinforcement learning. Okay, so basically, inverse reinforcement learning is the field where we're trying to figure out agent objective, value, or rewards by observing their behavior. Okay, so typically in reinforcement learning, we postulate that there's an environment where an agent make observations. There should be an S here, I'm sorry, but about the state of the environment. And then the agent takes an action or a series of actions in order to, and these actions will produce a reward. Okay. When we're doing like straightforward reinforcement learning, what we have in fact is a neural network. I won't go too much into detail in that, but so we have a neural network that take as input states of the world, and the output would be an action. But we also have a reward function that can map a reward in function of the state of the world and the action. And we want to train the system to maximize, in fact, the reward and find, so what action based on the state of the world will maximize the reward. So that's what we're trying to do when we're doing a straightforward reinforcement learning. In inverse reinforcement learning, we already have information about states of the world, actions, and the reward that the agent will receive based on his action in various states of the world. What we are trying to figure out is the reward function. Okay, so we're trying to maximize, adjust the weights in the network, the parameters, to maximize our capacity to figure out what reward we will have if we take that action in that state of the world. Okay. Why is this important? Because Russell's think that this approach could be useful to figure out people's preferences. Okay. Basically, in that case, the reward would be preference satisfaction. So more preference satisfaction would count for a higher reward in the system. Okay. We access that through human behavior because we have subscribed to revealed preference theory. And what we're trying to figure out is the reward function. Okay. So what type of behavior, depending on what type of action, I'm sorry, depending on different state of the world, will produce, what type of reward. Okay. So now, even like according to Russell, there's still a lot of issues with that approach. Well, I would say even before going with the two issues I mentioned here, there are very few convincing examples of successful usage of reinforcement learning in any way. Okay, for a problem much simpler than figure out human beings' preferences. And I know that some of you may know much more than I do, in fact, about the reinforcement learning or deep learning or artificial intelligence. So please feel free to, well, correct me if I'm wrong, if what I'm saying here is not perfectly accurate, or to provide additional example at the end of the talk if you want to. But in any case, so there's are very few examples of successful usage of inverse reinforcement learning. Sorry, but then other issues are that it's very difficult to move from a single agent problem to multiple agent problems. So if we have a situation where the system is interacting with multiple agents that each have different reward functions, obviously, because they have different sets of preferences. And then it's even more complicated to move to for a single agent problem to a human AI interaction problem. So if the interaction goes in two directions, it's even much harder to figure out. Okay, so those are two issues, but there are many issues. Okay, in any case, that was the second component of the approach. I think that so those are issues that Russell mentioned, but there are also even bigger issues with the approach so far. So well, first there's the issue of conflicting preferences, but I'll leave that aside. The other issue is that I've mentioned that earlier already, but I'm just repeating that. So far, even if we're able to do these two things, the only thing that we have, if we are successful, is a system that can maximize human beings' preferences. But there's no indication that a system that maximizes people's preferences is a system that will behave in a way that is ethically aligned. Okay, because there's a lot of cases where what people do is not the right thing. That's one way to put it. Okay, there are cases where, in fact, people's behavior or behavioral regularity overlaps greatly with morality. Okay, what we consider to be a moral behavior. But there are many other examples where it's not the case. So, for instance, if you take a game of tennis, okay, can you see when I highlight something on the screen? Sorry. Yes. Okay. Thanks.
Yes.
So if you take all right, thanks. If you take a game of tennis, well, in most cases, what people do when they play in tennis, it's an official game. They comply with the actual rules of tennis. Okay, they may have little tricks to cheat slightly with the rules, but they really cannot cheat that much. Okay, so if we have let's say we would have this like human compatible AI with components 1 and 2 that would just observe people's behavior in a game of tennis. It may be quite effective at like either replicating that behavior or figuring what people's preferences are. Let's say the robot would then be a teammate to one human agent in a game of tennis or something like that. Okay, so maybe that would work well. Okay, because what is morally expected is also the type of behavioral regularities that we can observe in the environment. But there's a lot of cases where it's not like that. Okay, where human beings don't typically do what we ought to do. Okay, so people commit murder, state fight against each other at the international level. We make completely crazy consumption choices that are fueling a climate crisis, such as buying a car or using a car, at least not an electric car. We exploit animals. We don't respect the rules when we're driving. So we're doing all these things, okay? So this approach in itself would be completely insufficient for building moral agency in a system. We need something else, okay? What do I see here? Oh yeah, it would still be very impressive, okay, if we would be able to do that, but it's still insufficient for artificial moral agency. To be sure, achieving accurate behavioral prediction and preference alignment would be a significant breakthrough, but this does not guarantee that the system will be a moral or ethical agent. So we need a third component in order to do that. We need to subscribe to a form of utilitarianism. Okay, so not only we need to have the system that will figure out agents' preferences, but we also need a system that will have the capabilities to not maximize the preference of one agent, but figure out what is the right action that would maximize total preference satisfaction at the level of society. Okay, only in that case can we claim that the system is morally aligned. Now, it may not need to be perfect, but it need to have a strong sense of like total preference satisfaction in society, not just one agent. And so it's basically a view in moral philosophy that is utilitarianism. I'm sure that most of you have heard the view before. I don't know how familiar you are with the view, but it's basically a moral theory that claims that a good action or the right thing to do is what will maximize total aggregate utility in society. And utility is just a bit of jargon or a notion used to describe such things such as like pleasure instead of pain, or more well-being, or perhaps happiness, or some other things. Okay, so we're using that placeholder because we want to bracket the issue of specifying exactly what we want to maximize, and we speak in terms of utility, but it's something along these lines. So it's either well-being or preference satisfaction. Okay, if you think that preference satisfaction is an acceptable proxy for well-being. So, but that's what the system needs to do. Now we know that there are also a lot of problems with that view. Okay, I'll just go a bit faster here because I see I've been speaking for a while already. But it's so people sometimes have expensive preferences, so it needs a lot of resources to satisfy specific preferences of some people. So should we sacrifice them, or should we just sacrifice people that are a minority group simply because this will boost utility for the majority? What about I'll leave that one aside, but what about our actual capability of making comparison between the level of preference satisfaction that the same action would produce on two different persons? Okay, that in fact is it's a big philosophical issue, but it's also an issue as soon as you want to make like public decision based on utility maximization in society. Because if you cannot figure out, like compare the level of utility for one person with the other, there's no way of knowing if that decision is really, maybe it's just having a small impact on one person and a huge impact on another, or a small impact on everyone. So it's very difficult to make choices between different type of alternative. Anyway, so this problem is very well known, and it's called the problem of the impossibility of interpersonal comparison of utility. Okay, but those are big issues with utilitarianism. Again, not new issues, but if we build a system that it will be like some sort of like an utilitarian maximizer, we'll be facing these issues. The system will reproduce these problems. Okay, and of course, a big underlying issue is that it's very complicated to make that calculation. Okay, so that's why Russell needs to introduce like a fourth component in the approach. And it's the idea that, well, the approach is well, not an actual approach that we're gonna like implement tomorrow in a system, but more like some sort of a proof of concept. Okay, we know it's gonna be very imperfect. And in fact, the approach can only work when we have like unlimited or nearly unlimited computation, because it's so complicated to maximize utility at the level of society. Okay, so we need that to do that. And I don't think I need to go into a lot of details to show like how problematic this is. Maybe it's useful for a proof of concept. Sorry, sometimes it's used in like mathematics, on AI or computer science, because it's a useful like thought device to think about a problem or an issue. But if we really want to create actual system that will behave ethically, it's a big problem that we have this as one necessary component for the approach. So if there are challenges with Russell's approach, what are possible alternatives, or what does the literature say in general? Is it like the most approach that's being put forward by most people in the field of artificial moral agency? Yes, I still have a few slides with actually a lot of information in them, but I'll just go faster here. I think because I've been speaking for a while and I want to leave us some time for question. I think that sometimes you try to keep it just an hour long usually, so I don't want to take too much time. But let me just say first that artificial moral agency is a popular topic. So rest assured, this is not like the Standard & Poor 500 index on the stock market. Actually, it's looking a lot like, now that I think of it, it's looking a lot like stock markets right now. But anyways, it's the level of, so I have a query that with one of my colleague, Travis Lacroix, we're working on this, we're making this review and corpus on the literature on artificial moral agency. And so we've built a query to extract like a relevant document. And anyway, that's the result of the query. So we see the number of hits we're getting per year through time in the Scopus database. And that database is one of the biggest database for research in the social sciences and humanities, at least. Okay, the coverage for The STEM fields is not so good, but in social science and humanities and a lot of other related fields, they have a very good coverage. In any case, we can see that considerably more people are talking about artificial moral agency, were talking about artificial moral agency in 2021 than they were not even 20 years ago. Okay. So of course the number is very low in 2022 because I think I've pulled out that graph maybe in June this year. So we were only at the beginning of 2022. So what type of approaches are they putting forward in general? Well, as it turns out, a lot of different approaches. Okay, we can classify them in at least in 5 big families. So first, in the first category, we have what I call axiological approaches or axiological embedding. I'll just name them and then I'll explain them briefly. Then we have codification approaches. We have what I call behavioral emulation. We have psychoemulation, bioemulation, or evolutionary approaches, and all sorts of like very special mix of these things or other like less common things. Okay, these are all like families of approaches for attempting to embed artificial moral agency in the system. Even within these families, we have a lot of subdivisions. Okay, so perhaps axiological embedding is the most intuitive approach. It's certainly one of the first that was put forward. It's basically the idea that we should try so we should start with some moral theory, so deontological ethics, for instance, or utilitarianism or virtue ethics, and we will try to build that theory in the system. Okay, when we are developing the system, before the system is even like sent in the environment to behave or do things. Okay, so we'll try to make, say, a deontological medical robot that when it's interacting with all people in the healthcare system, it's able to be very respectful or take into account their special needs. Okay, things like that. Or we'll want a system that will really behave in a way that will maximize utility, patient's utility in the system. Okay, so that's one family of approach. Another approach that is becoming increasingly popular, maybe we're past that, but it sure became very popular when we started to have interesting results and we could do interesting things with deep learning. It's the codification approach. So in that case, what we're trying to do is to train, either a classifier or anyway, a neural network on documents or claims or data that contains a lot of underlying moral principles. Funny enough, or strangely enough, or anyway, a lot of people are claiming, for instance, that perhaps we could use child stories, okay, to train a system. So we would feed a lot of child stories to the system, and because it's always very moralistic, the system could figure out like human ethics or morality based on this system. So we would find a way to codify the underlying morality, implicit morality in the corpus, okay, in the documents. Another family of approach is to try not to behave in a deontological way, in a way that would be like embedded directly in the system, not codify like moral rules that exist in some documents that we consider are good references, documents or claims or discussions or things like that, but to simply copy or imitate human behavior, emulate that behavior. Okay, so that could either mean to conform to people's expectation, or it could mean really to try to imitate the behavior. Okay, so that's another way we could try to do things. Okay, so there's a bit of that in Russell's approach. There's also a bit of this here. Okay, in his approach, definitely, because he wants to build an utilitarian system. Then we can try to emulate specific parts of the human brain or psychology. Many people are claiming, in fact, that a system could not really be moral if it would not be able to emulate like some of the moral emotions that we have, perhaps. And that's something we'll see very commonly in the literature. Quite a few people also claim that in fact, it's not possible to achieve artificial moral agency as long as we're not able to reproduce something similar to human cognition. Then there are suggestions to reproduce intentionality or moral competence, but really at the psychological level. Sentience or consciousness, we have a few contributions that say that. And again, and then after that, we have, so some people are claiming that what we should emulate is not specific elements of human psychology or behavior, but it's really other, like even more lower level biological function. Like we should reproduce like something similar to neuronal cells or signaling system that exists in some biological systems or things like that. Okay, and we finally we have evolutionary approach that claim that we should develop like system that can, well, I don't know exactly, have some sort of fitness and can evolve through time. Okay. So like I said, historically speaking, and even today, one of the most popular approaches is the axiological embedding approach. So we have all the approach here on the graph with the number of papers that are claiming putting that approach forward. Codification is also a very popular approach, and it's psychoemulation that is the second most popular approach, in fact. Now you have a breakdown of these approaches here. So within axiological embedding, so we have the subcategories like the ontological embeddings, and we can see the evolution through time. So the ontological embedding has always been a very popular approach. We see here it's in green, but so is like utilitarianism or consequentialist approach. And but there are also a lot of many other approach that fall within that category. And here the last chart is psychoemulation through time. And we see that, well, what is very popular is to claim that we should emulate affects or emotion. Then it's cognition. And anyway, we see the evolution through time. Another thing that we that is interesting in the literature is there's basically two, in addition to these implementation approach, another feature is the directionality of an approach. So should we try to build all the moral capability in the system when we're developing the system and then deploy the system in the environment, or we should create a system that builds this moral knowledge either because of its interaction in the environment or things it's figuring out from either important text or what people are saying, or so it can either be top down or bottom up, and we see that there are variations through time. Okay, I won't say much about that, just in the spirit of going faster. And finally, one thing to mention is that it's still a very much theoretical issue. Okay, even if we already have artificial moral agents, we in fact a lot of the contribution are still theoretical contribution. So those would be the contribution in blue here in the graph. Okay, and here on the top it's just the ratio of each for any given year, so it's normalized to 100%. And we see that like a lot of contribution are theoretical. Very few, in fact, scientific contribution discuss actual prototypes. Okay, those would be in orange, or even model, actual trained network. Okay, or ways to train a network more specifically. Okay, they're very much theoretical still, even in publication in the computer science. And we also have many skeptic views. Okay. Okay. So in conclusion, what to do of all of that, or what are like the most important like research question we should tackle with today in the field? Well, obviously, one of the first question is how to implement artificial moral agency. What's the best approach? Obviously, it's still very much debatable. But also, like, what's the best proxy to get to whatever we want to get? So is preference the best proxy for well-being? Is behavior the best proxy to access human preferences, or it's other thing? Perhaps it's just feeling of approbation or disapprobation. Perhaps that would be a better proxy to train an agent. What are the best signal to do that? Should we feed feed a video feed to the system? Should we feed very schematic description of what is going on in an environment? So what's the best signal to feed to a system to build some form of moral competence? And how can we scale from low level the low-level properties, the properties of low-level artificial moral agents, to high-level agent also, because we already have these agents and we're already able to build them. Second big question is how to perform accurate benchmarking. It's not possible to develop an artificial moral agent if we're not able to test that agent capabilities in a control environment and compare its capabilities under a specific design with other systems. So this may seem very basic, but at this point, we have basically no way of comparing the moral competence of two systems that will be developed according to two different approaches. What are current business practices regarding artificial moral agency, and what are at the more like social level, what are like the best policies that we should put forward in order to make system that would be more ethically aligned? All right, so I think that's it. Thank you very much. I've talked for a long time, but I do hope that you have questions. And I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Dominic. This was an excellent talk. I personally enjoyed very much, and by the claps you're getting, I think everyone enjoyed it very much. So I know there was a lot of discussion going on in the chat there. Maybe we'll take one or two questions.
Okay. My chat window wasn't open, so
no, it's fine. It's fine. I think
all these discussion, but
yeah, people I think were chatting amongst themselves about what you were saying at the during your talk.
But let me just say right off the bat that I love Tyler's first comment about the good place. It definitely is. I think every serious moral philosopher now has an obligation to quote The Good Place at least once in any serious material. No, I'm kidding.
I'm going to stop our recording now.
Yeah, please.